I read The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson for the Cosmere of Summer that I am doing, where I'm reading every one of the Cosmere stories in their publishing order, including short stories, novels, graphic novels, the whole thing, and then talking about the connections between the stories as I go along. And so if you don't want spoilers for the previous two Mistborn novels and the Elantris stuff, then you should stop listening. So this wraps up what is called the first era of the Mistborn story. And last time I talked about how maladaptive behaviors were kind of the main theme of the book and the ways that the internal conflicts the characters were represented in the magic system of the story in the terms of the pushing and pulling. There was a kind of pushing and pulling between the old way that the characters were and the new thing that they were starting to become, and how Elend and Vin needed to overcome their maladaptive behaviors in order to kind of have to push past that to get to a better place where they can have a more healthy future, more healthy relationships with each other and all of their friends. And so in this book, I think the evolution of that continues, but it enters into a new space that has to do with the idea of paradoxes. And the main theme, I think, in this book has to do with paradox. And so a paradox is a complicated idea that is something more than a mere contradiction, because a contradiction is kind of a mistake, if you will. Something where you've made some kind of error in what you're positing. So, for example, like a married bachelor, that's just like a contradiction. That's a thing that can't really exist. So one of the biggest paradoxes in kind of philosophical and religious studies, especially for us Anglophones in the West, is the idea of a Christian God who is omnibenevolent, but also allows for suffering in the universe. A God who gives us free will, but doesn't stop us from using that free will to harm other people, but is also somehow perfectly just and perfectly kind and good. And this is the central kind of paradox, I think, that in the story, Sazed is concerned with, at least in the early part of the story, right? Because he's lost Tindwyl, who he was in love with in the previous book, and this fractured his sense of faith, which is central to his identity. And so in the first book, Sazed is constantly kind of proselytizing people, telling them about the over 300 religions that he has in his copper mines, and trying to get people to believe in these lost religions in order to, in Sazed's mind, kind of enhance their lives, give them a spiritual practice that has nothing to do with the Lord Ruler, which is going to help them to kind of free them from the Lord Ruler's culture even more than they already are as Ska rebels. But once Sazed comes up against this hard loss of an element of his life that he thought was impossible to attain, which I think exists on two levels. The first level is that Tindwyl was romantically interested in him when, I think in Sazed's mind, that was the kind of thing that was impossible for him to have as a eunuch, since he had his sexual organs taken from him as a child. He sees himself as less than a man and completely undesirable to a romantic partner. And so he's kind of closed off that part of himself that could have ever had that. But Tindwyl doesn't really want that side of a romantic relationship. She doesn't want a sexual part of the relationship because she was specifically abused in a sexual way by being part of the breeding program for the Terrace people. And so she had to have many, many children throughout her life. And so that's just a part of her existence that is not attractive or desirable anymore. Instead, she wants the kind of romantic and intellectual and spiritual companionship of having, a partner who she can trust and respect and care about. And Sazed is kind of the perfect person for her in that way. The second way that Sazed got something that he feels like he never could have had is the approval of one of the terrorist keepers. And I think this is the thing that I didn't say in the last podcast, what was kind of, talking around. When I went back and edited that episode, I realized that, when I was talking about the avoidant behavior that he had, the maladaptive behavior, why is he having that maladaptive behavior of rebelling against the terrorist people? I think it's the kind of thing where it's like, I reject you first before you have the chance to reject me. So it's an avoidance of pain. It's an avoidance of the possibility of acceptance because Sazed feels that he cannot be accepted, that there's something unacceptable about him. And so the riskiness, the emotional riskiness of putting yourself out there to be rejected or to be accepted is just too much for him. And so he just kind of rejects them before they get the chance to reject him. But when it comes to Tindwyl, she kind of stepped past that whole situation because she was already in Luthadel when Sazed arrives to do his further research. And then she kind of inserts herself into his research. And that means that, she de facto kind of accepts him as a keeper and gets to engage with him on a level that he's already pushed away all of these other terrorist keepers through his behavior. So she's kind of accepting that behavior and then additionally accepting Sazed at a deeper level that he felt he could not ever have. And so once he gets these two kind of emotionally impossible things for himself in the second book, they're taken away from him when Tindwyl dies in the battle for Luthadel. And I think because Sazed's proselytizing of religions was one of the core elements of his rebelliousness against the terrorist culture, that's why he has this deep fracturing away from who he was. That coping mechanism is now unavailable to him because this deep emotional pain is too related to the subjects of what religion is all about. And so what does Sazed do? He goes back to the form of the coping mechanism that he was doing, the maladaptive behavior that he was doing before, but now with a new content and a new target. So the form of what he was doing was rebelling against the terrorist culture via, hooking up with the Ska rebellion, right? Or I guess that's the content of what he was doing. But the form of it is having a target and then kind of rebelling against it, pushing back against what it is. So the terrorist people require that you be nonpartisan, that you be impartial, and that you just kind of stand back and let history play out. Don't be in the limelight. Don't put yourself out there because that will get you found out and that will kind of unravel the entire secret that the keepers still exist. And so he pushes against all that. He does the exact opposite of what the intention of that culture is in order to kind of pre-reject those people so that they can't reject him in turn. When it comes to the religions, he's doing a similar kind of thing. So now he is pushing back against each of the 300 something religions in his copper mines by examining them through a purely kind of materialist, logical lens that has to do with contradiction. So in other words, we're back to that kind of formal distinction that I just made between contradiction and paradox. A contradiction is doing with the kind of terms and logic that is involved in the culture, in this case, of each of the religions. And so Sazed examines the traditions and cultures and actions of these different religions that he has information on and searches out contradictions. And once he finds them, then he eliminates the religion as being invalid because it contradicts himself, or it contradicts itself. And previously, like in the first book, the characters would ask him, which of these 300-something religions do you believe in, Sazed? And he would say, I believe in all of them simultaneously. And then they would respond, isn't that contradictory? Don't they contradict each other? And he's like, oh yeah, absolutely. But I don't have a problem with that. And so before, Sazed had room for these contradictions, but now he's taking comfort in rebelling against the thing that he feels has rejected him. He had this acceptance that felt impossible to him. And on some level, I think he attributed it to the way in which the universe kind of like trends towards optimism in the Cosmere, or like happiness or goodness. And Sazed associates that with the hope that is built in with all of the different faiths that he has studied. And once he loses Tyndwyl and he loses those impossible feelings of acceptance, inclusion, romanticism, and all of that stuff, he blames the religions themselves for failing him. And now they are the focus of a kind of authority that has failed him in the same way that he felt the terrace culture failed him by rejecting him. And so he acts out in exactly the same kind of psychological maladaptive behavior disposition. He rebels against it. He goes against the culture of having room for paradox and contradiction. So he eliminates these religions one by one as a way to soothe his own pain of loss, but also, I think, to avoid the larger question of like, how did I have room for that before, but I don't have room for it now? Like, what is he really trying to get at? I think he's trying to run away from what's inside of him, which is the deeper fear that he has of being accepted by someone and then in turn rejected, like losing that acceptance. And you can see this, I think, in the larger gap between him and the rest of the crew throughout most of the novel. He doesn't have that tight emotional bond with all of the characters like he used to anymore, because that distance is a kind of like, in the same way that he did with the terrace people, a pre-rejection, like he's pushing them away before they can push him away. Everything about Sazed's internal emotional life has become too risky for him to continue to care about people and be vulnerable in the same ways that he has been in the past. So that's the way in which I think paradox is starting to operate early in the story for Sazed. And like I said, it is directly related to that paradoxical question of spirituality that we have in the West, of grappling with the idea of an omnibenevolent God who simultaneously allows, for holocausts and wars and atomic bombs and tsunamis and all of that stuff, at the same time that is supposed to be like caring about everyone and justice and goodness. You could look at that, and I think that this is what Sazed does in this part of the story, and be like, that's a contradiction in terms. That's a logical, rift that means that belief system is essentially broken. it must require that either this God doesn't care about those things, those injustices, or doesn't care about people so much that those things bother this God, or that the God is somehow an evil God and enjoys that kind of suffering. And that's why bad things happen in the world, because the God of the universe is evil, maybe. So you try to find ways to rectify these contradictions instead of approaching them as paradoxes. So the paradox sits uncomfortably as something that is two things that cannot rest together. This is the essential nature of what the paradox is. So if we were going to talk about a paradox that isn't a religious, philosophical type thing, you could look at like the classic liar's paradox, where you say, this sentence is a lie. Well, if it's true that that sentence that I just said is a lie, then it can't be true, and therefore it would have to be a lie, which would make it true. And you can kind of see the way in which that whole sentence is really tricky to deal with if we're just looking up the definition of every word as we go along and how they relate to each other. There's nothing in the sentence that makes it an incorrectly constructed sentence. It makes perfect sense. You can understand the meaning of the sentence, in other words. But when we examine the truth value of the sentence makes a kind of claim on the truth. And when we examine that, it kind of explodes out into a contradiction that is constantly flipping its polarity based on our assumptions of what the sentence means. And so the sentence is able to simultaneously contain at least two different ways to read it that are mutually exclusive. And this seems like, the opposite of how language should operate. Language should be, every word has a definition. And when you put those words together, the sentence should be a coherent statement that says a particular thing. But instead, the sentence of this sentence is a lie implies multiple different meanings within it that are self-contradictory. And it does all of that without being a failure as a sentence. So if we look at that and then reapply it to this question that we're having of an all-powerful God who is omnibenevolent but allows for suffering in the universe, you can see the way in which we could understand that not as a contradiction, but as a paradox that contains more meanings than we are necessarily comfortable with if we're trying to analyze things in a logical way. I think Elend has a somewhat similar journey. I claimed in the previous podcast that Elend is kind of the hero of maybe the Mistborn series in terms of arriving at his role to leadership and his comfort level with it, and an understanding of his integrity and his entire personality before anybody else, kind of completing the arc of his heroism and becoming someone that generations of people going forward in the story will look up to as a paragon of like leadership and what it means to be an emperor and a Mistborn and on like that. In this story, he's really worried about the ways in which he has a similarity with the Lord Ruler. And he comes to see the Lord Ruler as less and less of an essentially evil person who was mismanaging the empire that he ruled over, and somebody who was trying to mitigate a cosmic level disaster while protecting his citizens from being aware of the amount of danger that they were actually in. And mostly, I think Elend is worried about becoming a hypocrite, which is a different version of like the contradiction that we're talking about, right? So if a person could be said to be a contradiction, the word that we would use for them is a hypocrite. I think that you can see the persona of a hypocrite in the story best in the citizen, which is the antagonist to Spook's story, who is a person that talks about equality and freedom and getting out from under the rule of the Lord Ruler, the nobility, the allomancers, all while at the same time having access to allomancy, taking on the behaviors of the nobility, and doing public executions in exactly the way that the Lord Ruler did. In other words, he is a complete hypocrite. He claims to have a particular political ideology, but then his behavior contradicts the claims that he's making rhetorically. And it seems like all of everything that he's doing is a cynical move in order to get more power, rather than a sincere pursuit of like the best civic outcome for everyone that might briefly include mistakes that come off as, hypocrisy or contradictions. Like, oh, I made a mistake. I didn't understand that, this kind of action is necessary. Instead, these feel like calculated choices that the citizen is making, and that he doesn't care about the ways in which his behavior contradicts his rhetoric. And that's what makes him in the story feel so much like a hypocrite. That's the way that Elend is worried about his own behavior. He's like, am I just like the Lord Ruler, since I made myself the emperor of all of these different kings? And when I go into a region, I conquer it, I bring the Kolos with me, and I slaughter people until they submit to my rule, and then I take their resources and I reallocate them to the, places in my empire that need them the most. And the focus that I have as a leader is not on the well-being of the people per se, but on the larger conflict between ruin and all of civilization. So he has the same kind of view and priorities as the Lord Ruler, and he's worried that this makes him a bad leader, or at least a hypocritical leader. And I think what Elend has to kind of grow into is this awareness of being a paradox. By having the antagonist of Yeoman, who is this prelin in the old religion of the Lord Ruler, as, the person that he is set against in his story for the most part, the person who is sincerely and authentically trying to prosecute the government of the Lord Ruler in the aftermath of his destruction, it shows the ways in which those two characters are the same, I think. And that comes down to authenticity, sincerity, really the virtues that characterize who Elend is as a character. He is just a guy who wears his heart on his sleeve to a certain degree, and he's very honest intellectually about, aligning his conscience with his actions. The fact that he's even worried about being like the Lord Ruler kind of says something about who he is, and in fact, I think points out the way in which he is not like the Lord Ruler, who was not worried about going too far or doing the wrong thing necessarily. Like, I think at the end of the first book, he says something like, I was never wrong in doing this thing that I'm now doing the opposite of, and I never have been wrong, and I never will be wrong, right? So, like, the Lord Ruler is not like Elend in that way. But Yolen is, and Yolen's not a hypocrite. But Yeoman is someone who is short-sighted. He doesn't have the full vision for what's going on in the conflict because he has his mind made up by this very rigid religion that has become a core element of his identity. And so he's trapped by his beliefs to be like, oh, I can't cross over this threshold into this new perspective because it would contradict the thing that I have been for my whole life, or this thing that guides me, this larger structure that I have put myself inside of. I need to not exist as a contradiction in terms of how I relate to the steel ministry as a religion. Elend is not housed within a particular ideology. Instead, he rides according to his internal conscience. He's not being guided by a larger kind of corporate structure of some kind of institution. Instead, he can use institutions as tools in ways that kind of frighten him and give him some pause, the way that he can make an alliance with the Church of the Survivor without having sincere belief in it. But it doesn't contradict his feelings of conscience. It doesn't contradict his personal integrity. Yeoman has this feeling that something else is going on, but he can't allow himself to come in contact with that, in a psychic way, because it will manifest a contradiction that will shatter his relationship with the institution that forms the core element of his identity. In other words, he suppresses his conscience in a way that contrasts with Elend. And so we can see that Yeoman's villainy is located in his dysfunctional relationship with his own personal conscience. The story is saying this is the way that a leader should not be, in contrast to what's going on with Elend. So Elend's relationship with his conscience being his guide allows him to kind of embody the paradox of being a leader who is responsible for the well-being of all of the people in his empire, but being focused on a more cosmic level threat that might sacrifice the well-being of those very people that he is responsible for in order to mitigate that crisis for the long-term survival of the civilization. That's something that Yeoman could never accomplish because he doesn't have the space to exist in a zone of paradox. He can't be contradictory things at the same time because it would shatter his identity and he would not be able to function anymore. And in fact, we can see that in the climax of his story where Marsh shows up and starts to give orders and behave in a way that completely contradicts the doctrines of the steel ministry and the ways in which, he's supposed to be operating. It makes plain to him that the Lord Ruler is truly and in fact dead when he's supposed to be an infallible and immortal living God. And then the things that he intended for the future can't possibly happen if the goals and actions that Marsh is taking are true about what the religion demands of him. And so he just kind of folds under the pressure of that entire situation and ceases to be a leader. In other words, once Yeoman encounters the paradox, it destroys him. He's not able to absorb it because of the way that he is oriented internally, I think. And speaking of the citizen and his hypocrisy and stuff, I think that's similar to the kind of story that Spook goes through in the third book. We haven't had a whole lot of Spook, but we get a lot of his interior perspective in this. And he becomes a kind of like Daredevil character, from Marvel Comics, which is a little bit fun, but also kind of weird. You could see the way in which Brandon Sanderson loves his superheroes and he loves to, think about the limits of the powers that his characters have and whatnot. But I think there's an irony built into what Spook goes through in his story because he is having his senses greatly expanded beyond the normal human limits of what should be possible, and yet he fails to perceive the contradictory and hypocritical behavior of the Kelsier who speaks to him and kind of corrupts him throughout his story, right? And so he has a very hyper-aware sense of the material world, but he has a very numb and naive sense of his interior world. And so I think his journey is about growing up and having, internally growing up and kind of coming to a parallel awareness inside of himself to the kind of hyper awareness that he has on the outside. And the influence that this version of Ruin, who is pretending to be Kelsier, has over Spook is to bend him towards being a hypocrite in the same ways that the citizen is. And so Spook sets himself up to be a kind of version of Kelsier, where the citizen is like a version of the Lord Ruler in his imagination, and Spook comes in and is going to disrupt and overthrow his little miniature government. And Ruin plays into that kind of fantasy by not only giving him the power of Pewter, but like stoking his ego about what he should be doing, and also pointing to the ways in which Kelsier resorted to violence first very often and had a certain kind of glee in killing the nobility. I think this gets back to what I was saying in the first book, how Kelsier is not the kind of paragon hero in the story. I think that a lot of the fandom really enjoys Kelsier and we love him. I really like Kelsier. He has this Robin Hood quality to him. He's very complex and conflicted, and he has like a good journey and everything. But Elend is by far more heroic in terms of what the story itself is kind of ratifying. The signals that the story is sending to us and saying, like, here is what a good person in this story looks like, is much more Elend than it is Kelsier. And I think the ways in which Ruin points out to Spook that, like, you should kill people the way that Kelsier did speaks to my sense of that kind of calibration or like spectrum in the story. Like Kelsier sits, somewhere between good and evil if we're looking at the first 3 books. And he kind of had to be that guy, because he came from this incredibly upside down society of like being built on cruelty and evil. It's going to produce a kind of brutal man who is the only person who's going to be able to overcome that kind of oppression. But at the same time, the story has these moral limits to it that say, like, well, even though it was necessary, it wasn't necessarily acceptable or good in the larger picture of things. So I think there's a way in which, Kelsier himself is a kind of paradox, that while he was necessary and did a good thing and participated in overthrowing the Lord Ruler, there's all of these villainous elements to his character that are going to have to get worked out over time in terms of the seeds that they planted in the larger culture and what is going to be celebrated and reproduced in the culture because those qualities existed in Kelsier. But when we look at the larger Cosmere, I think there's a kind of moral realism to the universe where those things are not okay. When you're talking about like what is good and evil, a lot of the things that Kelsier did were evil. And so they're putting into the culture a kind of signal of virtue for things that are not actually virtuous. in exactly the same way that like you look at somebody like Set or even Elend's father Straff in how they operate as kings. They're just doing the things that the Lord Ruler made virtues of. They are quote unquote good rulers in terms of like if we're judging things according to the ways that the Lord Ruler wants things to be operated. But the Cosmere kind of says that morality and civilization in that way is not relative. There is actually a bedrock moral reality to the Cosmere, and that some things are incompatible with each other. But I think that's what makes Kelsier so uncomfortable in Sanderson's story, because he does have these purely heroic qualities while carrying these villainous aspects. And so it makes him a kind of paradox in the story and actually like gives the Mistborn series at large a lot more energy than I think it might otherwise have if you made Kelsier a more simple character. I'm like, if you know, you know. Like I'm trying not to spoil things as I go along, but you get what I'm saying if you know. But the growing up that Spook does in his conflict with the citizen has to do with an expansion of his personal conscience and the way in which he follows that instead of aspiring to be like Kelsier and encountering those contradictions and paradoxes that Kelsier had to his personality, right? Over and over in the story, Ruin tells him to do things, and Spook rejects those things that are morally wrong out of hand and says like, no, not yet, or not right now, or I'm just not going to do that, and instead does some other thing. But then he feels bad about following his conscience and tries to like adjust his behavior to be more like the survivor, more like Kelsier, and try to, put the citizen more mentally in the shoes of the Lord Ruler. Like, in other words, to try and create this kind of archetypal situation where he's almost role-playing as Kelsier. And when Sazed and Breeze show up, to assist him, he even takes over the crew in the same way that Kelsier did and starts to drive their plans and be the leader. And so he's really trying to like live up to this role model, but it causes him to project things onto the citizen that are not true. Like he's taking qualities of the Lord Ruler and projecting them onto the citizen and simultaneously kind of pushing himself to follow the orders that Ruin is giving him that feel to him like they would be things that Kelsier would do, even though internally he has this feeling that they're not good and he shouldn't do them. And so when Spook's story ends, it has to do with rejecting that persona of Kelsier that was perverted by Ruin, but also trusting in his own conscience above everything else. And so I think that internal perception kind of expands in the same way that his physical perception has expanded. And so like symbolically, he kind of steps into this person who fully perceives the world. Like he comes to understand that it's not really Kelsier, that it's something else that's talking to him, and that it's actually also talking to the citizen. He perceives the way in which, like the mechanism that is causing that in terms of the metal that's in his body, and he removes it and literally throws Ruin and Kelsier's persona away, and then steps into himself and kind of accepts himself as a work in progress, a person who contains contradictions and is basically a paradox. That's what a person is. A person who wants one thing but does another, a person who wants to be good but unintentionally does evil. And because of the work that he's done internally, he's able to achieve justice and even pass along the very crucial bit of information that plays into Marsh's story. And so Marsh might be the most extreme version of a paradox that we get early in the story, where his personality has been completely overwritten by ruin because of the hemalurgy effect that's going on with him. So the more spikes that have been put into his body, the more access ruin has to him. And what we see is like a direct conflict. I think out of all the characters, like Marsh is not a hypocrite. Marsh is like a living contradiction in a very essential way. And he kind of prefigures harmony, I think, in some ways, that there is an element that is irreducible and unconquerable that is Marsh, but it is encapsulated or kind of like surrounded spiritually and psychically by this more massive force in Ruin. And so Ruin's consciousness kind of overrides Marsh's. And so he sees things like murder or natural disasters like the exploding volcanoes and tsunamis and all of that kind of stuff as being beautiful. He like literally perceives disaster as being desirable and good. And it's not like an inauthentic version of the experience. It's an utterly perverted version that is dominated by the perspective of ruin. But simultaneously, there's this little piece of him in there still that understands and feels things in the way that Marsh authentically would if ruin was not there. And so it takes all of his kind of like internal strength to preserve who Marsh is at his core and just kind of survive internally this experience of being completely dominated. And that endurance and that, that survivorship, that preservation that Marsh goes through is what gives him access, to the information that Spook sends along about the way in which Vin is pierced and therefore compromised by ruin as well. And he's able to, in the midst of a frenzy of violence against a person that he actively loves, that he is perceiving as being very pleasurable and good. Like he's enjoying beating Vin and dominating her and hurting her. He's enjoying the prospect of murdering her. He's enjoying the end of the world. But in the midst of all of that enjoyment, he does a thing that contradicts that feeling. But in that contradiction, it is a completely authentic expression of who he is. And it hurts Vin, but he does so in an act of love and in order to free her from the very act of murder that he is involved in. And so when he rips out the spike from Vin and hurts her in that way, it also frees her and it contradicts the will of ruin, which has dominated him this whole time. And so he's able to hold that ecstatic pleasure of evil while also holding that intention for pure moral good and the self-sacrifice and the hurting of someone who he loves for their own good all at the same time. And so Marsh is the first full embodiment of a paradox that I think we get in the story. And like I said, prefigures Harmony, who comes at the end. In Vin's story of being a paradox is the working out of the ways in which she had these maladaptive behaviors in the previous book. And like I said, she doesn't fully land, I think, in that second book from the way that she was kind of coping with her problems in the past and who she is becoming. And that makes sense because she is basically the hero of the trilogy And we need to have some place for this character to go, right? And so she re-encounters the noble culture of beauty and of, pretty dresses and makeup and dances and fancy castles and all of that kind of effete stuff that she has told herself she should not enjoy or have access to because on some level she doesn't deserve it. She has this shame inside of her. And at the end of the second book, she has chosen to have love. She's accepted marriage with Elend, and she has chosen to be the empress, and she's chosen to have power. She's understood the failure that she had at the Well of Ascension to take the power that could have changed her life. But she's not fully reconciled to who that would make her if she lived her life in that way. And so she feels like, okay, I have this duty to the Empire, to participate in this war and become the kind of instrument of destruction for the Empire and to protect Elend and to protect my people. Sure, I can go ahead and do that. I understand how to be a violent Mistborn. I was trained by the best, right? Like Kelsier was my teacher. I can do that job. But does she have the room? She has all that hardness in her. Does she have the room to be soft and feminine? And that's the journey that I think that she goes on through this book. And she, instead of dominating the Kolos, she does the same kind of thing that she did in the previous book with Tensoon, where she learns from the Kolos. She forms this connection with the Kolos who calls himself human. And that in itself is also another symbolic paradox, right? There's this monster, which absolutely is not human, but who calls himself human, is a kind of like Frankenstein's monster type of figure, right? The undead creature who wants to be understood and treated like a full person, but in fact does not have those qualities, to conform to that category. And it's through him that we find out the secret of how the Kolos are made and the way in which that's related to the hemalurgy that is ruled over by Ruin. And so those hemalurgic spikes are a kind of, physical representation of the corrupting influence that Ruin can have over people in the story, the way that his perspective kind of perverts and dominates the perspective of whoever is pierced with the hemalurgic metals. But human on a deeper level still longs to be fully a person, even though he will never have those qualities since he is a Kolos. But he still has qualities in kind with humans, and one of those qualities is the very longing itself to be what you are not, to have what you cannot have, to be a kind of person that maybe you can never be. And that's the same desire that Vin feels. She feels that she can't be reconciled to love dresses and be a courtly puff in the way that she says, but also to be this deadly imperial assassin at the same time. Those things are a contradiction in terms, but she has to expand who she is and her understanding of herself in order to step into being a paradox, to being both the push and the pull at the same time, and understanding that there's a fullness to that that transcends the simple reducibility of categories in their own terms. So the reason that a Kolos cannot be a human is because those are two different categories, right? And they're mutually exclusive. But humans' desire to bridge that gap is representative of the larger project that Vin engages in through the story. And so her primary antagonist, I think, is Ruin itself. That's who she's struggling with, his influence over her and the way that he's trying to frame an understanding of herself to herself. And all of the conflicts that she encounters throughout the story help her to step out of the framing that Ruin has had over her for her entire life, because she's been talking about, even from book one, the very moment that we meet her, she is experiencing the voice of her older brother, Reen, who, tells her, this is the way the world is. This is how you should understand yourself. This is how you should understand other people. But in fact, all of those things are just lies and perversions from Ruin. And so she has to kind of unlearn or set down all of these patterns and ways of being that, like I said, these maladaptive behaviors that have gotten her through her past troubles, but are not going to be what's going to allow her to go into the future, at least in a healthy and full way. Instead, she's going to have to accept that sometimes to be a full person, you're going to experience yourself as a contradiction. Every person who exists in themselves in a full and healthy way is a paradox at an essential level. And I think this is ultimately expressed in the climax of the story and the climax of Vin's story as well, where she takes on the quality of preservation. She absorbs and elevates into this level of being a god. And the power of preservation is such that it will not fight, it will not destroy, it cannot do harm, because that is against the intention of what preservation is. But since Vin has cultivated the ability to become a paradox in and of herself, she uses that power of preservation to attack. And she is able to destroy the psyche and persona that is inhabiting Ruin and kind of free up its energy to then later be absorbed. So because she herself is something bigger than any one intention can encapsulate, and she's not worried about contradicting herself anymore, she is both the assassin and the woman who loves dancing and pretty dresses. She's able to take that power of preservation and use it to destroy Ruin. And we also get to see the same kind of journey for Tensoon, who has been defined by his relationship with the contract and stands in as a kind of archetype for all of the other Khandra people. We can understand the Khandra as a category and as a culture because we understand Tensoon and his relationship with the contract. And that Tensoon has entered into a place where he now is supersedes the contract, that he understands that the contract is inadequate to deal with what is coming in the future and the present state of the world. Because the Lord Ruler has died, who formed the contract in the first place, the contract is now void. And so something new needs to be put into place. And so when he goes back to his culture, he's not following the laws of what the Khandra people are supposed to be doing, but instead he is bringing forward these more primal rules, or the fundamental reasons that the Khandra were brought into being in the first place. So they were kind of formulated, according to the Lord Ruler, to be spies, to be simultaneously made of Ruin's hemalurgic properties, but of preservation's intentions. In other words, the Khandra themselves operate as a type of paradox. And the problem with the Khandra overall is that they have come to identify themselves too much with the idea of preservation and therefore have become locked in or kind of frozen into a particular way of being and are uncomfortable with contradicting themselves or operating as a paradox. And so TenSoon has to fracture and remake their culture itself so that they can get back to the fundamentals of who they were designed to be. And I think this speaks to the kind of thing that I was talking about earlier with Kelsier and his relationship to, good and evil in the Cosmere at large. There's a way in which TenSoon is a rebel against his society, but is also getting them back in touch with something deeply fundamental and truly good at the deep level of moral realism in the Cosmere. So the Lord Ruler invented them with the intention of kind of being spies, that they have aspects of both ruin with intentions of preservation. So when that essential moment comes, that they would give Ruin his body back because they are compelled to, since they are controlled by his perverted perspective of reality. They would give the evil god what the evil god needs to destroy the world. At that last minute, they would deny the evil god what he needs by destroying themselves. That's the kind of thing that I think Kelsier is actually not capable of in the first book. So that's why I say that he sits in this more ambiguous place. TenSoon is kind of sweeping away the elements of the Khandra culture that prevent it from being the paradox that a spy needs to be in order to ultimately serve the deeper goal of the spy, which is preserving the country for which the spy serves, right? In other words, there's like a more fundamental and real element at the bedrock to the spy's behavior. There's an absolute line that cannot be crossed, which would be a betrayal or a treason of the country. If the spy crosses that line, they're no longer a spy, they are a traitor. They're not a person who can walk in to the enemy camp and misrepresent their loyalties and intentions. Instead, they just simply are a traitor, right? So there's a fundamental moral boundary to what a spy is. And that's kind of what I'm talking about in the Cosmere at large. There's a fundamental moral realism that cannot be abrogated in order to be considered good. And Kelsier crosses those boundaries sometimes. And so it puts him in a place where he cannot be one of the absolute heroic characters of the Cosmere, but that gives him like an interesting and unique energy and a unique place, going forward in the story. But anyway, back to TenSoon. So he's getting the culture back to something really fundamental, where they're able to do this last minute betrayal of Ruin, which makes Ruin vulnerable to Vin's strike. And so the entire operation of the Final Empire kind of teaches our heroes everything that they need to know to get to this moment where preservation energy is used to destroy Ruin's persona and then free up the energies of both preservation and Ruin, which then fall to Sazed, and all of the accumulated knowledge of the Terrace people and all of like that wisdom and information that was preserved from the time before the Lord Ruler are used to rectify and heal the world, while Sazed simultaneously becomes a paradox by holding within himself the energies of preservation and ruin simultaneously. And so the kind of like conclusion of the story, or like the apotheosis of this premise, where we have, what if the Dark One defeated the good guys in the kind of hero's journey fantasy story that we all are so familiar with and is such a trope in the genre, ends up in a place where, what if preservation and ruin were reconciled in one person? And what is the outcome of that? It's not necessarily this kind of perfect utopia, but it's a world in which people are allowed to be fully flawed and still exist as equal people going forward. So like, they don't have to be perfect heroes. In other words, that who comes to rule over the society? It was the outlaws in the first book, right? So the outlaw has become the ruler without having to become a totally different kind of person. While they have gone on journeys that have expanded their perspective and maybe given them new skills, at their core, they are still the same people. And that kind of paradox of who they were at the beginning of the story and where they end up is not a contradiction in terms, but instead an expression of the fullness of what it means to be a human person in the world. I think both in the Cosmere, but to us also as readers, and to like better understand that that is what people are in kind of, Brandon Sanderson's view, maybe, for who people are in the real world. We are a bundle of contradictions that, if we allow ourselves to get past our anxieties about that and our griefs and our compensations, our kind of maladaptive behaviors, we can kind of get out of our own way. We could transform not only ourselves, but the societies that we live in to be a more equitable and forgiving place for everyone to exist in. So it's not a perfect utopia, but it's, a place that can accommodate everyone and give them the space to fully become who they are at their best selves. And I think this whole thing is like a more complex evolution of what we saw in Elantris. It feels more satisfying. It has a darker edge. There's a lot more kinetic action and violence in the Mistborn trilogy than there was in like all of Elantris as a novel. And so it's more exciting. At least for me, it feels more like an adventure. There's something about Elantris that's way more meditative and gets at a more fundamental look at, philosophically, what it means to construct a society, what it means to be even a human being or a living person. It kind of picks at those things in a real intellectual way, where Mistborn just kind of, it has those elements to it as well, but it kind of like sweeps past them and has all of this exciting adventure that kind of can carry you past that stuff if that's not what you're here for. And so I think it can appeal to a much wider group of people. And I think there's a lot of people who really love Mistborn and will tend to bounce off of other stories in the Cosmere because it doesn't have that edge that Mistborn does, but also doesn't have that like crunchy action and the way that the magic system feels like it has this real materialist set of limits to it that give high drama in those action scenes in a really like satisfying, punchy kind of way that the other magic systems aren't calibrated to deliver because they're really aiming at a different feel. So there's a real unique element to Mistborn that's a lot of fun, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It feels like a fun, cool action movie that has a lot of like philosophical depth to it at the same time. There is this other element that I want to kind of introduce here and start to talk about going forward in the larger Cosmere project, though, that has to do with this philosopher of storytelling named Mikhail Bakhtin. That's like a Russian name that's like Mikhail. But he's a Russian formalist who looked at novels as they were emerging in the 1800s and as a new form of art, a new form of storytelling. There's arguments about this, like, can we find examples of novel storytelling, before the 1800s, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, some people have argued, or in the medieval courtly life of Japanese women. I'm not really here for that debate, but like in terms of Bakhtin's importance in the Russian formalists, what he's really concerned with, or what I'm going to take from his stuff, because he's concerned with a lot of different things, is this idea that novels can deliver to us in terms of storytelling art something utterly unique that has to do with what he calls the polyphonic voice. So poly means many, and phonic means, to speak or to say. And so polyphonic is to have many voices. So this is what he's talking about. And he contrasts it with an idea of a monological voice. And so he says that, some storytellers are monological and other storytellers are polyphonic. And he thinks that novels are uniquely situated to take advantage of the polyphonic voice. So different modes of storytelling are more suited to certain artistic expressions. Like there are things that movies are good at that novels are not, and that novels are good at things that movies aren't, if you kind of get what I'm saying. And so Bakhtin is comparing novels with older forms of storytelling like folk tales and legends or religious stories and things like that. And so when you compare like Little Red Riding Hood to a short story by Dostoevsky, Dostoevsky is able to bring into his story a kind of polyphonic set of views, that there are many different perspectives that are being expressed that are not forced to conform to one ideological disposition, and are instead allowed to exist in an irreconcilable form. Like they cannot be reduced or understood as elements to a larger expression of some kind of ideological viewpoint. So that is a whole bunch of $10 words I just threw into a podcast that I think doesn't fully convey what I'm trying to get across. So like the story of Little Red Riding Hood, everything in the story is kind of calibrated to deliver a message about, if you are a young, vulnerable woman, you should be careful about who you trust, right? The world is dangerous. People are not what they appear to be. Some people will try to appear to be trustworthy. They will appear to be people that you love and should trust. But in fact, you should be wary of that. And you should trust your instincts when you notice that the details are off with people. Someone represents themselves as a person that you should trust and love, but something inside of you is telling you, that person seems dangerous. That person seems like they don't have my best interest at heart. You should go with that feeling, because if you don't, they're going to destroy you. That's kind of the monological point of Little Red Riding Hood, right? You can't reduce Dostoevsky's novels and stories down in the same way to have this person represents that, or this person is doing this in the story in order to get this kind of outcome. And at the end of the day, we can see the way in which the story is saying this one kind of moral fact about the world, which corresponds to Dostoevsky's point of view. Instead, he's saying the stories contain this polyphonic interplay, which gives a more complex kind of energy and leaves us with it. When we walk away from the story, we can feel these competing energies inside of us that don't settle nicely to produce one particular point that is supposed to kind of overwrite maybe our own perspective with Dostoevsky's perspective. And so there's a way in which he's saying the novel at large can be a kind of paradox, which we can then take inside of ourselves and use the energy of that to produce new and unique perspectives in our own life, that it can become an engine of transformation internally for us that gives us something new that we never would have encountered in ourselves otherwise, and that could not be predicted by the artist themselves because they're not trying to come to any particular conclusion, and they're not building into their fiction anything in particular that is like kind of building to some certain point or ideology. In other words, there is a way in which the universe itself contains all of these contradictions and produces different viewpoints and energies that we as people are kind of pinballing around and bouncing off and adapting to all the time. And all of that kind of chaos can be contained in a novel and then delivered to us in a way that is unique, according to Bakhtin, in terms of an art form. So that is a whole lot of talking that I just did that has nothing to do with the Cosmere. But the reason that I bring it up is because I think that Sanderson's work occupies this unique space, especially when you're looking at the Cosmere, which is this large group of interrelated stories that kind of make a constellation of a super story that we will eventually get to see when the project is completed. And I think we experience, in exactly the same way that I was talking about earlier, Mistborn as being distinct from Elantris. There's a different feeling, a different energy that we have when we read Elantris than when we read Mistborn. And so they feel like different voices. So the Cosmere, as we go forward, we want to try and look at each of the literal worlds that we go to and the characters that inhabit them and their dispositions and the kind of vibe, if you will, of the place, and see that they feel very distinct from each other and like they are constructing a kind of polyphony, I think. So within a larger, like bigger structure, if we zoom out from Mistborn and consider Elantris and Mistborn, we can see like a larger set of voices kind of emerging in this bigger story structure. And you could, zoom back down into Mistborn since we're talking about the end of this trilogy, and I think you can see lots of different distinct voices. However, I don't think that Sanderson is delivering to us the kind of polyphonous experience that Bakhtin is interested in and believes that the novel is uniquely equipped to deliver. Instead, he has a more monological style, like I said, where Kelsier exists as a character who cannot achieve a fully heroic expression because he has these villainous attributes. In other words, there's a way in which the Cosmere has a hard materialist morality to it. There are moral limits within the Cosmere between good and evil that are at their core monological. And I think there's a way in which they probably correspond directly to Brandon Sanderson's core values as a person, beyond just him as an artist and an author. And so when we look at things in this third book, like hope and faith and what faith does, I think at one point, one of the characters, I'm not remembering who it was, says that to have faith is to believe that there is always an answer to the problem you're facing. That is the thing that faith actually gives you. And that hope is kind of the fuel to that type of faith. You can see that as a core heroic quality that links Raoden and Kelsier and Elend and Vin and Spook and Tensoon and all of the heroes that we've encountered so far in the Cosmere. These are all characters who believe that these insurmountable problems that they're facing, in fact, have a solution. And just because the character can't see it at that moment doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. They have faith that there is an answer to every problem that comes up. That is a core element of what goodness is in the Cosmere. And that core element can't be contradicted. There's not room for that. The characters who believe that, oh, we can't overthrow the Lord Ruler, or ruin cannot be successfully resisted, have already lost to those things that they don't have the perspective to include the overcoming of. In other words, part of what defines their villainy is a failure to have faith and to have hope, to cultivate hope. What defines their villainy, what is villainous in the Cosmere, is to believe that problems don't have solutions, and therefore the solution to an insurmountable problem is compromise. It is to change yourself to fit into the problem's disposition. That's what we saw with Wraithen. That was like his major problem in Elantris. That's what we see with the behavior of Straff across the two books that he's in. That's the problem that Yolen has in this story, where he can't get past the religion that he's a part of and see the larger contradiction that, the Lord Ruler was trying to solve. In fact, the Lord Ruler himself uses hemalurgy. He uses the elements of ruin. He compromises with them and says like, oh, these things can't be fixed. Instead, I have to just kind of include what ruin is in my solution for ruin. And therefore he's already been undone. And the ways in which Kelsier fails as a hero are the ways in which he, says there's no way to solve the problem of the final empire without murdering all the nobles, right? There's moral boundaries to the Cosmere that cannot be crossed without becoming a villain. In that way, the Cosmere itself is monological, which is fine. I don't need the Cosmere to be polyphonic in order for it to be quote unquote successful, or to live up to some kind of notion of what Bakhtin says the novel could be at its fullest artistic potential, right? What's interesting about the Cosmere is that it is monological while it includes this polyphony of different worlds and perspectives at the same time. And so I think the artistic expression that's happening of Sanderson's view of the world is that there are lots of different kinds of people in the world, and that's okay. There's lots of different ways of seeing things in the world, but at the end of the day, there is a way in which there's goodness and there's badness in the world, and that we can encounter that goodness and badness and express that goodness and badness, but that we are also people and that we deserve inclusion and grace, and that we are big enough, in our contradictions, to be paradoxes who will encounter these things, but not be utterly dominated by them. And so maybe at times we are good and at other times we are bad, but that we are never, we are always dynamic, and that we are always kind of moving between these polarities, and that there's a way in which we could trust to our conscience to build a society that will help us to unlock our better selves, I think is like the larger message of the Cosmere. And so it's monological in that way, but it has this room for a polyphonic disposition. And that's pretty unique, I think, even for the stories that are, spanning many, many novels and many different kinds of worlds, because Sanderson's not the first person to do this. Like, lots of people have had these expanded large universes, both in, literary fiction, but also in genre fiction, which is what he's writing in. You've got people like Ursula K. Le Guin had, large science fiction universe or fantasy universe, or you had like Isaac Asimov had these huge amounts of books that seemed to be from different worlds, but actually came together to form one kind of coherent big universe, or maybe coherent. Coherent might be strong, but you get what I'm saying. Like, he didn't invent the kind of overstory way of doing a thing, but I think he's doing something really interesting. If you know about this Mikhail Bakhtin way of looking at stories, where he has synthesized these elements that, to Bakhtin, these are incompatible. You can't have the monological and the polyphonic in one story, but Sanderson has kind of done it. He's kind of made this paradox, I think, where he has a monological universe that contains a polyphonic perspective. And that's a kind of unique, special, interesting thing about his artistic project that he's doing here with the Cosmere. It's part of what makes me so interested in his work, because I fight against his monological tendencies. They annoy me as a reader and as a person who thinks about fiction, to be kind of like preached at every once in a while in the story, and to sense those moral boundaries that he has gets under my skin. It kind of bugs me about his stories. But at the same time, he has this very wide and inclusive tendency to his universe that has a lot of room for people like me who are annoyed at those boundaries. And so I think that is a unique aspect to his storytelling that you don't see in a lot of other genre fiction. The tendency, I think, in genre fiction is to construct a universe which just like utterly ratifies the perspective of the author, and it is just like a kind of allegorical playing out of their monological perspective. And the degree to which competing voices exist in the story is just to be dominated and subdued and used as a counterexample to the monological perspective, whatever that might be. Like, you can have a perspective, that has nothing to do with a kind of Christian morality or whatever, or like a stance on faith, like Sanderson seems to be saying, or goodness. and it still be monological if you're drowning out those other competing voices. If you're, in other words, coming to a reconciliation at the end of your stories where you're kind of saying this is the right way and this is the wrong way, that's what makes it monological. It's not about the particular content in the story. And so it's not that I'm bothered by what Sanderson says is good and I think something else is good. I'm just bothered that he says something is good at all, is kind of what bugs me. But he manages to say that something in particular is good while also saying, but also there's all these other ways of being at the same time. And so he's kind of pulling off something that should be impossible or should be a contradiction. And he's kind of doing it with style. And it's really interesting. And I'm mostly interested to see if he can pull it off at the end of the project. Like, where does the whole thing land? That's what I'm really curious about in terms of this, whole thing that Mikhail Bakhtin lays out for us in his schema of the polyphonic voice and the monological voice. So that's a thing that's really on my mind as I'm going through the entire Cosmere. So the next book in the progression of, things that were published was Warbreaker, the next novel. And that's a standalone novel that's on a completely different world with a new magic system and all new characters. So that will be the next book that I read in the Summer of Cosmere.